The Soviets thought their secrets were safe. They were wrong. While the world feared nuclear war, American technology was already dismantling the Kremlin's secrecy from the edge of space. This is the war you never saw. Welcome to the unfinished file. The year was 1950, and the world was frozen in a new kind of conflict. The Iron Curtain was not just a political line. It was a wall of absolute silence that turned the Soviet Union into a total information black hole. In Washington, the CIA was in a state of silent panic. They knew the Soviets were testing nuclear weapons and building massive factories, but the Americans were flying blind. They had no idea where the launch sites were or how many bombers Stalin actually possessed. This was the great blind spot, and not knowing the enemy's strength was the greatest threat to human survival. To solve this, the Americans first tried Project Genetrix, sending thousands of high-altitude balloons with cameras over the USSR. It was an embarrassing failure. The Soviet Air Force simply shot them down and displayed the captured cameras in Moscow to humiliate the United States. Washington realized they needed something that defied the laws of physics. They needed to touch the edge of space. This desperation gave birth to the U-2 program, developed in the legendary Skunk Works facility by Kelly Johnson. This aircraft was an aerodynamic anomaly. The U-2 was not built to fight. It was made to survive through the pure power of altitude. It looked more like a giant, slender bird than a jet. Its wings were impossibly long, designed to grab every molecule of lift in the near vacuum of the upper atmosphere. At 70,000 feet, the U-2 was in its element, but it was dangerous. The pilot flew in the coffin corner, a razor-thin margin where one wrong move could cause the plane to disintegrate or fall like a stone. There was no room for error and no hope for rescue. The pilots were a different breed, living in pressurized suits that were the ancestors of spacesuits. They breathed pure oxygen for hours before takeoff to prevent their blood from boiling if the cabin failed. On July 4th, 1956, the first U-2 crossed the border, performing a technical invasion of Soviet privacy. As the U-2 cruised over Leningrad and Moscow, Soviet radars lit up in a frenzy of rage. Nikita Khrushchev was informed that an American spy plane was directly above the Kremlin. He was livid and ordered every MiG interceptor to climb and destroy the intruder. Soviet pilots pushed their engines until they flamed out, falling back to Earth as they watched the tiny silver speck of the U-2 cruising 20,000 feet above them, untouchable. For 4 years, the U-2 brought back the holy grail of intelligence. The photos proved that the bomber gap was a fabrication. Khrushchev was bluffing, flying the same small group of planes in circles over parades to fool the West. The U-2 allowed President Eisenhower to keep his cool during crises because he knew the Soviet military was actually much weaker than the propaganda suggested. The Lady in Black had stripped away the Soviet Union's greatest weapon, its secrecy. But the game was becoming lethal. The Soviets were developing the SR-71, a missile that could finally reach the U-2's altitude. The CIA knew the window of invincibility was closing. On May 1st, 1960, France's Gary Powers was on a mission over the heart of the USSR when a massive explosion rocked his plane. A Soviet missile detonated close enough to rip the wings off the fuselage. Powers found himself in a dizzying 70,000-foot plunge. He managed to eject, but the U-2 incident became a global catastrophe. The U.S. tried to cover it up with a lie about a weather plane, but Khrushchev revealed he had the pilot alive and the cameras intact. The era of the U-2's absolute dominance was over, but the revolution in surveillance was just beginning. Even as the U-2 fell, the CIA was already looking higher. If they couldn't use planes, they would use the stars. This led to Project Corona, the first spy satellite program. The challenge was immense. There was no digital photography yet. The satellite had to take a photo on a physical roll of film, eject it in a heat-shielded bucket, and let it fall through the atmosphere. The Air Force then had to catch the falling parachute mid-air, using planes with giant hooks. The first 13 missions were disasters. Some satellites exploded, others were lost in the ocean. But the 14th mission changed everything. A pilot successfully snagged the film bucket over the Pacific. When those photos were developed, the CIA saw more of the Soviet Union in one day than all U-2 flights combined. They saw every missile silo, every shipyard, and every secret base. The Soviets were paralyzed. They could see the satellites on their radar every 90 minutes, but they were helpless to stop them. This transparency forced the Soviet Union into a corner. They began a massive campaign of maskirovka, or deception. They built fake tanks, fake aircraft, and even fake cities to confuse the American cameras. They moved their most secret projects underground or covered them with massive roofs. But American technology kept evolving. New infrared cameras could see the heat from underground factories, and high-resolution lenses could see the serial numbers on Soviet tanks. The psychological pressure on the Kremlin was devastating. They realized that their entire empire was a glass house. Every secret was being watched from orbit. This forced the Soviets to spend billions on defenses that were already obsolete. The terrifying technology of surveillance was not just about taking pictures. It was about destroying the enemy's ability to hide. This was the true power of the American eyes in the sky. It turned the Cold War into a game where one side could see all the cards in the other's hand. As the satellites grew more powerful, the United States maintained its lead. They moved from film to digital sensors with the KH-11 satellites, allowing for near real-time surveillance. The Soviet system, built on total secrecy and the control of information, could not compete. By the 1980s, the Soviet leadership realized that they could no longer hide their economic failures or their military weaknesses. This transparency, forced upon them by American technology, was a primary factor in the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. The unfinished file of surveillance had proven that the most powerful weapon in the world was not a bomb, but a camera that could see through the darkness of a closed state. The fallout from the 1960 U-2 incident left the American intelligence community in a state of absolute paralysis. With Francis Gary Powers in a Soviet prison and the diplomatic world in ruins, the United States was suddenly blind. The Dragon Lady had been their only window into the Soviet heartland, and now that window was shattered. President Eisenhower was under immense pressure. He needed to know if the Soviets were mass-producing intercontinental ballistic missiles, but he could no longer risk sending pilots into the Soviet sky. The solution to this crisis was hidden in a project so secretive and technically ambitious that it sounded like pure science fiction at the time. This was Project Corona, the world's first true spy satellite program. The goal was simple but terrifyingly difficult: to place a high-resolution camera into orbit, photograph the entire Soviet Union from space, and return the physical film to Earth. In the early 1960s, digital technology did not exist. There was no way to transmit high-quality images via radio waves. To see the enemy, the CIA had to use actual, physical rolls of film, miles long, and specially designed to survive the harsh radiation of outer space. The logistics were a nightmare. The satellite, hidden inside a Discover rocket, would orbit the planet at 17,000 miles per hour. Once its mission was complete, it would eject a reinforced canister known as a film bucket. This bucket would plummet through the atmosphere, protected by a glowing heat shield that reached temperatures of thousands of degrees. As it reached the lower atmosphere, a parachute would deploy. But the Americans could not let the film hit the ocean. Salt water would corrode the silver halide on the film, destroying the intelligence. This led to the creation of the most daring recovery maneuver in aviation history, the mid-air snatch. The plan required Air Force pilots to fly C-119 cargo planes equipped with massive, retractable steel hooks. These pilots had to intercept the falling film canister as it drifted down through the clouds over the Pacific Ocean. They had to snag the parachute lines in midair, winching the precious cargo into the plane before it touched the waves. It was an aerial trapeze act performed at hundreds of miles per hour. For the first 13 missions, the program was a heartbreaking string of failures. Rockets exploded on the launch pad, satellites disappeared into deep space, and film buckets were lost in the vastness of the sea. The public was told these were Discoverer missions for scientific research, but behind the scenes, the CIA was hemorrhaging money and prestige. Many in Washington wanted to cancel the program, calling it a billion-dollar hole in the sky. Everything changed with Discoverer 14. In August 1960, a pilot named Harold Mitchell successfully caught the first film bucket in midair. When that film was developed at a secret lab, the results were staggering. In a single day of orbiting the planet, a single Corona satellite had photographed more of the Soviet Union than every U-2 flight in history combined. The images were a strategic earthquake that changed the Cold War forever. For years, the Soviets had used Maskirovka, a sophisticated doctrine of deception, to trick the West. They built dummy cities, painted fake shadows of aircraft on the ground, and moved their missile silos into remote forests. They wanted the world to believe they had hundreds of nuclear missiles ready to strike. But the Corona cameras saw through the lies. They identified the secret launch pads at Plesetsk and proved that the missile gap was a total myth. The Soviets weren't leading the arms race. They were struggling to catch up with American industrial power. The psychological impact on the Kremlin was devastating. Soviet radar operators could see the American satellites crossing their territory every 90 minutes, but they were helpless to stop them. The satellites were too high for their missiles and too fast for their interceptors. This forced the Soviet military into an exhausting and expensive game of hide-and-seek. They spent billions of rubles trying to camouflage their entire military infrastructure, but American technology kept evolving. New infrared film could detect the heat signatures of underground factories even in the dead of the Russian winter. The United States had achieved the ultimate high ground. This level of transparency was a primary reason why the Cold War never turned into a hot, nuclear conflict. Because the Americans could see the truth, they didn't have to guess based on fear. They knew exactly how much pressure the Soviet system could handle. The Corona program ran until 1972, providing over 800,000 images that mapped every corner of the Eastern Bloc. It laid the foundation for every satellite system we use today, from GPS to modern weather tracking. But as the 1960s progressed, the CIA realized they needed more than just orbital photos. They needed a machine that could strike at a moment's notice, moving so fast that it could outrun the laws of physics. They needed a ghost that could scream across the sky at 3 times the speed of sound, taking pictures and disappearing before the enemy could even confirm its presence. This requirement led back to the Skunk Works and to the creation of the most intimidating aircraft ever built, the State Route 71 Blackbird. As we move into the next chapter of this silent war, the focus shifts from the cold vacuum of space back to the heat of the atmosphere. While satellites watch from above, a new breed of titanium monsters was being prepared to haunt the Soviet air defense network. The era of the Lady in Black was over, but the era of the Blackbird was about to begin, and it would push the Soviet Union to the very brink of technical collapse. Every secret the Kremlin tried to bury, every missile they tried to hide, and every communication they tried to secure was now under a microscopic, digital, and supersonic watch that would not end until the Berlin Wall finally came down. The eyes in the sky were no longer just observers. They were the silent architects of the Soviet Union's eventual downfall. This was the terrifying reality of American surveillance, a machine that never slept and never blinked. By the mid-1960s, the battle for information had reached a fever pitch. While satellites provided a global view from orbit, they were predictable. The Soviet Union knew exactly when an American satellite would pass overhead, allowing them to hide their most sensitive movements during those brief windows of exposure. The CIA needed a tactical eye that could strike anywhere, at any time, with no warning. This requirement gave birth to the most legendary aircraft of the Cold War, the State Route 71 Blackbird. If the U-2 was a delicate glider, The Blackbird was a sledgehammer of technology. Designed by the genius Kelly Johnson at the Skunk Works, the State Route 71 was a machine that looked like it belonged in the 22nd century. It was built to fly at Mach 3.2, more than 2,200 miles per hour, at altitudes above 85,000 feet. At this speed, the friction with the atmosphere was so intense that the aircraft's titanium skin would glow red-hot, reaching temperatures over 600 degrees Fahrenheit. The construction of the Blackbird involved one of the greatest ironies of the Cold War. The United States did not have enough titanium or to build the fleet, so the CIA established a complex network of front companies to secretly purchase the metal from the only major supplier in the world, the Soviet Union itself. The Soviets unknowingly provided the very material used to build the plane that would haunt their radars for decades. The State Route 71 was a masterpiece of engineering. It was designed to leak fuel on the runway because its titanium panels only fitted together perfectly once they expanded from the extreme heat of high-speed flight. For Soviet radar operators, the Blackbird was a recurring nightmare. When they detected in State Route 71 entering their airspace, they would scramble their fastest interceptors, the MiG-25. But it was useless. By the time a Soviet pilot could even attempt a missile lock, the Blackbird was already hundreds of miles away. Over its entire career, more than 4,000 missiles were fired at the State Route 71. Not a single one ever hit its target. The pilots didn't need flares or electronic jamming. They simply added throttle and outran the explosions. But the American eyes in the sky were only half of the story. To truly understand the Kremlin's intentions, the United States needed to hear what the Soviet generals were saying when they thought no one was listening. This led to Operation Ivy Bells, one of the most dangerous and secretive underwater espionage missions in history. In the early 1970s, the CIA and the NSA discovered a secret Soviet undersea communication cable hidden deep in the Sea of Okhotsk. This cable connected the Soviet Pacific Fleet's headquarters to its nuclear submarine bases. Because the cable was located in Soviet territorial waters and guarded by a sophisticated network of sonar and patrol boats, the Kremlin believed it was completely impenetrable. They spoke openly about their most sensitive naval strategies and nuclear capabilities, convinced that their words were safe beneath the waves. The Americans decided to do the impossible. They sent a specially modified nuclear submarine, the USS Halibut, to find and tap that cable. The mission was a suicide run. If the Halibut were detected, the crew would have been captured or killed in a place where the U.S. government could never admit they existed. Using specialized saturation divers who lived in a pressurized chamber for weeks, the Americans placed a massive, high-tech recording device around the cable. This 6-ton waterproof cylinder, known as the tap, used induction to record every signal passing through the wire without ever cutting it. Every few months, a submarine would return to the dark, freezing depths to retrieve the recording tapes. For over a decade, the United States sat in on the Soviet Navy's private meetings, gaining a level of insight that was previously unimaginable. They knew which Soviet submarines were malfunctioning and which commanders were losing their nerve. The discovery of the tap years later, due to a disgruntled American trader, shocked the Kremlin to its core. It proved that the American reach was not limited to space or the upper atmosphere. It extended to the very bottom of the ocean. The combination of the Blackbird's invincible speed and the silent ears of Ivy Bells created a psychological cage around the Soviet Union. The Soviet leadership began to realize that their entire philosophy of total secrecy was a relic of the past. They were spending billions of rubles to protect secrets that the Americans were already discussing over coffee in Washington. This technological dominance didn't just provide intelligence, it acted as a massive deterrent. It convinced the Soviet hardliners that any military move they made would be seen and countered before it even began. As the Cold War moved into its final decade, the focus of surveillance began to shift from analog film and tapes to the digital revolution. The launch of the KH-11 Kinnan satellites marked the beginning of near real-time digital reconnaissance. Now, The president could see high-resolution images of Soviet shipyards transmitted directly to a monitor in the White House. This was the birth of the digital panopticon. The Soviet Union, a state built on the control of information and the suppression of truth, simply could not survive in this new era of transparency. The terrifying technology of American surveillance had successfully stripped away the Soviet Union's most powerful weapon, the ability to lie to the world and to its own people. The story of Cold War surveillance is not just a story of machines and gadgets. It is a story of how transparency can dismantle a dictatorship. By exposing the reality of Soviet military and economic weakness, these secret programs prevented a Third World War. They allowed for a peaceful conclusion to the 20th century's greatest conflict by ensuring that neither side had to act out of blind fear. Today, the legacy of the U-2, the Corona satellites, the Blackbird, and the undersea taps lives on in the technology we use every day. But the unfinished file is still being written. The eyes in the sky are more powerful than ever, and the ears under the sea are still listening. In the world of global power, the greatest weapon will always be the truth, and the machine that can see it will always be the master of the future. As the 1980s dawned, the silent war for information entered its most sophisticated and final phase. The era of physical film buckets falling from the sky and analog tapes being retrieved from the ocean floor was being replaced by the digital revolution. This was the birth of the KH-11 Canon satellites, the first eyes in space to use electro-optical digital sensors. For the first time in history, the United States didn't have to wait weeks for a capsule to be caught in midair. They had near real-time vision. A high-resolution image of a Soviet missile silo in Siberia could be captured, digitized, and transmitted to a monitor in the White House in a matter of minutes. This was the ultimate realization of the digital panopticon, a world where no secret was safe and no movement could go unnoticed. For the Soviet leadership, this was a strategic catastrophe from which they would never recover. The Soviet Union was a machine built on the total control of information. Their power relied on the ability to hide their failures from the West and, more importantly, from their own people. But by the mid-1980s, American surveillance had made that impossible. The CIA didn't just see Soviet tanks. They saw the bread lines in the streets of Moscow. They saw the decaying infrastructure of the Soviet economy and the mounting technical failures of their nuclear program. This transparency gave President Ronald Reagan the confidence to challenge the Soviet Union in ways his predecessors never could. He knew, through the eyes of the KH-11 and the ears of the undersea taps, that the evil empire was rotting from within. The terrifying technology of surveillance had exposed the truth. The Soviet Union was a superpower only in appearance. The psychological weight of being constantly watched began to fracture the Kremlin's resolve. Every time a Soviet general picked up a telephone or an engineer tested a new missile, they had to assume that Washington was listening and watching. This forced the Soviets into a ruinous arms race. They spent nearly 20% of their entire national wealth trying to build shields against American eyes and countermeasures against American ears. They tried to build mobile missiles that were harder to track, and they constructed massive underground bunkers like the Yamantau Mountain Complex. But it was a losing game. For every billion rubles the Soviets spent on hiding, the Americans spent a fraction on a new sensor or a better algorithm that could see through the camouflage. The cost of maintaining secrecy became so high that it literally bankrupted the Soviet state. When Mikhail Gorbachev took power in 1985, he inherited a country that was transparent to its enemies, but blind to its own problems. His policy of glasnost, or openness, was not just a political choice. It was a desperate admission of reality. He realized that in a world of satellite imagery and global communication, a closed state could no longer function. The American surveillance machine had successfully democratized information by force. By the time the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, the silent war was over. The United States didn't need to fire a single nuclear missile to win the Cold War. They won it frame by frame, intercept by intercept, and byte by byte. The cameras of the U-2 and the sensors of the Blackbird had done more to preserve peace than any treaty ever could, simply by removing the element of surprise. Today, we live in the digital landscape that these Cold War machines created. The legacy of the unfinished file is everywhere around us. The GPS system that guides your car was built on the navigation technology developed for spy satellites. The high-resolution cameras in your smartphone are the direct descendants of the digital sensors first launched on the KH-11. Even the fiber-optic cables that power the internet are monitored using techniques pioneered during Operation Ivy Bells. The world has become the very thing the Soviets feared most, a place of total transparency. But this new era brings its own set of terrors. The technology that once watched a hostile superpower is now integrated into every aspect of our daily lives. The eyes in the sky have not retired. They have simply multiplied. As we look back at the terrifying technology of the Cold War, we must ask ourselves what we have traded for our security. We move from a world of great secrets to a world of no secrets. The American surveillance machine proved that transparency can dismantle a dictatorship, but it also created a world where no one is ever truly alone. The unfinished file of surveillance is still being written in the data centers of the NSA and the cloud servers of global corporations. The case of the Cold War might be closed, but the machinery of the Watchers has only become more invisible, more powerful, and more permanent. The silent war for the truth continues, and in this new digital frontier, the battle is no longer for the secrets of a nation, but for the privacy of every individual on Earth. The story of the U-2, the Corona satellites, and the Blackbird is a reminder that in the game of global power, the greatest weapon is not the one that destroys, but the one that sees. The Americans survived the Cold War because they mastered the art of looking into the darkness. But as the darkness disappears, we are left standing in the harsh, unrelenting light of a world that never sleeps and never blinks. This is the legacy of the terrifying technology that changed the course of history. The Watchers are still there, 13 miles up and miles beneath the sea, waiting for the next chapter of the unfinished file to begin. The question is no longer who is watching, but who is left to watch the Watchers. This concludes our investigation into the most secretive era of human history.